All right, so we've got chapter 10. So like I mentioned before, chapter 10 is all about, we'll just call this northern transformations. And again, the years that we're looking through primarily are 1815, roughly speaking, about 1850. The point about 1850 is, I want us to focus clearly on the years before the Civil War. The Civil War breaks out in 1860, so we're not quite there yet. And at least from our perspective, because we live today, we know that there's going to be an incredibly bloody war on the horizon as we start talking about, these historical events and whatnot. But one thing to remember is that when trying to, understand history, it's always important to kind of put yourselves in the shoes of people who lived at that time, and to sort of understand that we know much more now than they knew back then. So this idea that everybody had kind of war on their mind wasn't actually the case, right? This was very much something that we can know after the fact. Chapter 11 is about Southern transformations. And before we get started, I'm going to mark at least in the north, there's going to be 4, right? 4 transformations that we'll talk about. I'll go to mark this maybe in a different color. We'll do yellow, 4, right? 4. The first one is relating to, this here, right? So we'll call this demographics. Demographics is just a fancy word for population. So one of the 4 major changes that takes place in the northern United States between 1850 and 1850 is changes in population. Number 2 is transportation, right? A change in the way that people get around, right? And not just people, goods and services as well, mostly goods. The third change that takes place is we're pretty much just going to explain this as the rise of the factory system. We'll talk all about how, this change affects pretty much a lot of parts of society, right? And that really is a change in the way that goods are made, right? So we might say change how goods are made. And of course, this has all sorts of effects on, this changes society, this changes culture, this changes politics, this changes family life, right? So this one is a rather big one, but we're just going to summarize it as changing the way that goods are made. And the last change that we're going to mark here in the north is down here at the bottom. And we'll go ahead and mark this. We'll just say number 4. And that is the change to farming, right? So 4 changes: demographics, transportation. We're just going to say number 3, the factory system. We're changing the way that goods are made. And number 4 is the changes taking place to farmers. So in the north, there's kind of more moving pieces in a sense. In some of the changes that take place, we'll learn next time that in the south, there's kind of less moving parts. There's really only one major change in the south, but that change, of course, has a huge impact on all parts of society. But let's go ahead and talk about differing population trends, right? Demographics, so what changes here. So one key term that you're going to want to be familiar with because it gets used a lot here is antebellum. Antebellum is just the time period before the Civil War, right? So anytime you see this term, antebellum, it simply just means, okay, now we're talking about a time period prior to the Civil War. So it could be used, for example, to describe the North. So we describe this chapter as the antebellum North. You could talk about it in the South, the antebellum South. You could say something like antebellum culture. That would be simply just the culture before the Civil War. But again, it just means anything before the Civil War. So it could even be, antebellum demographics, right? That would simply just be the population prior to the Civil War. And two things, or there are a couple of things, but one thing is that in the United States, population is growing, and it's growing rather significantly from two sources in some sense. One is what we might call a general, and again, this is very general because it doesn't apply to everybody in particular between these years. Increase in standard of living. And one of the major changes that takes place here, and we actually talked about this in a previous chapter, and I'd said, I think it was chapter 8. I don't know. Whatever the chapter was with Thomas Jefferson. I said we would talk about this in a lot more detail at a later chapter, and that was 10. And that was something we called the Industrial Revolution, which pretty much centered around the steam engine. And to be honest, I don't quite recall to what depth or degree we talked about this. So some of this might be repetitive here, but it'll probably be worth reviewing. And, the steam engine, which led to the factory system, which led to an increased number of material goods, in a lot of ways meant that people overall, not everybody, but people overall were experiencing a higher standard of living, a higher material existence, right? The material goods were much better. And this led to, longer life expectancies, lower mortality rates for children, and contributed to population growth. But also a big contributing factor was immigration, right? And immigration is simply people, we'll just say in this case, people coming to the U.S. from other countries. And this really picked up significantly in these years here. A lot of it has to do with some of the new transportation methods that are out there, and we'll talk exactly what exactly that is. Simply just became a lot cheaper and a lot easier for people to come to the U.S. But there were also other factors as well. And when we look at immigration, especially in this period before the Civil War, we want to focus mainly on Irish and German immigrants because they tended to be the largest in number. Well, that may not be technically true, but the immigration by Irish and Germans to the United States, yes, there were many of them, but what was important about these two demographic groups was really how they interacted with what we might call the majority culture of the United States. And that was there were differences. So, for example, the Irish who spoke English, right, or at least, close enough to it, tended to be Catholics. And this was at a time when actually, that's going to be a little bit confusing. We'll just leave it at that. That was coming at a time when the majority demographic in the United States was Protestant, right? So there tended to be a religious difference between the Irish and the Germans. The Germans, they could be Protestants, they could be Catholics. They were kind of mixed in their religion, but they were different in terms of their language, right? They spoke a different language. And in fact, even for some in the United States, like Benjamin Franklin, there were concerns that so many German immigrants were moving to the United States and this was coming at an earlier time period, not 1815. Franklin was dead at that point, but even a guy like Benjamin Franklin was concerned that there were so many German immigrants coming to the United States that the English would be replaced by German, just simply because so many people spoke it. The Irish immigrants tended to move more towards the cities. German immigrants tended to move more towards the rural parts of the country, farming, for example. Germans tended to move, again, we're making broad generalizations, but tended to move with their entire families. Men, women, children, again, moving off to the rural parts of the country. Typically, Irish immigrants tended to be men at first, and then their families joined them later, right? It's the Irish immigrants that tend to be most of the factory workers, right, in places like the cities. And so this led to, immigration plus just a general growth in population, plus what we might call in-migration. I don't know if your book talks about it, but in-migration is migration within a nation. All right, so these aren't people that are moving from outside the United States into the United States. These are people who are pretty much moving from the farm to the city, right? And so when we think about urbanization or urban, right, think city, that's what it means. And so in a very, very short period of time, places like New York, especially places like Philadelphia, but even some cities in the Northeast, places around Massachusetts, a lot of people moved to those areas in a very, very short amount of time. Now, the reasons for migrations, there are lots of them, right, when it comes for immigration. But generally speaking, we can identify what we call push factors and pull factors. Push factors would be things that cause people to pack their bags and move. So a great example of this in this time period applies right for us, and that is the case of Ireland. And that was the potato famine, which happened between 1847 and 1848. If you're not familiar, in Ireland, the potato crop failed, leading to a pretty disastrous situation in which 1 million people in Ireland starved to death and another 1 million people moved. And a lot of people that moved were pushed out by this. In this case, it was an agricultural failure. But we would identify this as a push factor, right? This is something that is causing people in one part of the globe to move to another, right? And, the amount of immigration that the United States experiences is truly mind-blowing when you think about it, especially if we reflect back on historical time periods. So at one point, I think, by the year 1900 or something like that, there were more Irish people living in New York than were living in the capital of Ireland, which was Dublin, right? Just to give you kind of an idea of just how intense immigration was. And it wasn't even the most intense in this period. In fact, after the Civil Wars is when immigration is the most intense, in all of American history, but still very intense here. And again, there were things happening like that in Germany. There were some failed revolutions that took place and people were, trying to get the hell out of there. And there's always push factors like general poverty that contribute to, getting people to pack their bags and move. Pull factors would be, what are the things that draw people to the United States, right? So in other words, a potato famine happens in Ireland. That person in Ireland seeking a better life has a lot of different places they could potentially move. And, so what would be a reason for the United States to be a destination? And so there are a couple of pull factors. I think just in general, we could say that transportation, we'll talk more about how transportation changed, but if it's just cheaper to take a steamship across the Atlantic Ocean, well, that's a luxury provided that maybe wasn't there in the past. You also have things like we might say certain political freedoms. The United States does have a Bill of Rights, regardless of how many times the Congress or state governments try and bypass it or ignore it. One thing that attracted especially a lot of men to the United States was that there wasn't, at least at this time, any mandatory military service, which in a lot of countries around the world, there was mandatory military service. And also just general economic opportunity. This is, things that can be, these are things that could be found elsewhere. But, in the United States, especially for German immigrants, a lot of cheap land, right? We talked about the way that the United States expanded westward with the Louisiana Purchase and, conflicts like, Tecumseh's uprising. Job opportunities in factories. The United States was one of the, industrial parts of the world and certainly growing at this time. So a lot of different sort of things contributed to this huge increase in population, right? However, this also led to backlash, right? The rise of nativism. nativism is kind of a catch-all term. We might call this, there's a couple different ways that you might be able to describe it. I mean, in sort of the most clear and kind of easy way to understand, we would just say, you know, this is a fear of immigration. I got a room here. A fear, anxiety, concern. In other words, the nativists were people who wanted to limit immigration. So we might say that. Oh, actually, we'll say that about the know-nothings. So again, nativism can be applied really to any historical time period. You can just talk about in general something like nativist sentiment. And nativist sentiment would just be, again, kind of a concern for immigration coming to, in this case, we're talking about the United States, but you can have, you know, you could have nativists in other countries. Like there could be, you know, a nativist kind of slant maybe or sentiment elsewhere. But the Know-Nothings are a very specific political party, right? So we'd call the Know-Nothings a nativist political party, right? A nativist political party, so a formal organization. And in general, where their efforts were kind of aimed at was what we might call anti-Catholic. And so their primary concerns were of the influence of Catholics in the United States, talking specifically here about Irish immigrants in particular. A little bit less concerned about the German immigration, I would say. A little bit less concerned about language, more concerned about religion and culture. And you can see some depictions of, or at least some primary sources here of kind of nativist work. So for example, this is a good one here. Let's see if I can zoom in a little bit. You know, recall last chapter, we talked about the age of Jackson. Right, you can't really see that, but that says ballot box, right? And in this case, there is a barrel of whiskey. You could probably assume who this person is. This is a lager of beer, even, you know, being written in the German language. Right, this guy is supposed to be Irish. And again, the idea behind this cartoon from the nativists is that you what essentially was happening was that Irish immigrants who came to the United States and German immigrants, and of course there's the kind of negative stereotype of overconsumption of alcohol, which at this time everybody overconsumed alcohol, but it was, you know, certain demographic groups were targeted for it. But of course, you know, the fear or the concern is that, you know, there are large portions of people coming from Ireland, coming from Germany, with no prior history or knowledge, or assumingly, right, that they have no prior history of any sort of knowledge about, you know, the United States, its history, its culture, its government system, and they can cast their ballots, right? Because during the age of Jackson, we witnessed that, you know, states had gotten rid of their financial requirements, pretty much allowing for propertyless men and men that didn't pay taxes to vote for the very first time. Here's another flag from the nativists. I think this one, you know, the irony in this one is, you know, I love kind of pointing it out. And of course, you know, it says here, Native Americans, beware of foreign influence. Now, of course, Native Americans here is not what we would think to be Native Americans. Really, in this case, Native Americans would be, you know, Protestant English speakers, right? Of course, the assumption being that, you know, those that were, you know, English, spoke English and were Protestant were quote unquote native, when in reality, or, you know, when we think about Native Americans today, we're talking about the people who lived in the Americas prior to 1492 and their descendants. The Know Nothing Party was, you know, they were very much influential. So, for example, in the election of 1860, the Know Nothing Party got so many votes that it nearly cost Abraham Lincoln that election. It didn't, but it nearly did. So again, to summarize, when it comes to immigration, kind of the points that we want to make here. One is that population grew, tremendously in the North between 1815 and 1850. That this population was different in terms of the demographics, a lot more Catholics moving into cities, German speaking people moving to the rural area, and that where this population was located in the cities, right, this move from farm to city or everywhere else, that cities were growing incredibly in terms of their numbers of people that lived there. So that's change number one. Any questions about the changes in demographics? Okay. So let's get to change number two. Excuse me. And that is the change in transportation. Now, I don't recall how much into detail we went over the impact of the steam engine. Actually, I could probably just check, to be honest. I'm just going to, chapter 7. Let me check real quick. Yeah, okay. So let's recall. I won't write this all again, right? This is a good kind of summary or review of what the steam engine is and how it's important, right? So I'm going to put this, right? We're looking at this right here. Okay, so steam engine essentially is this contraption here. It heats up water. As the water is heated up, the steam is released. This then powers some sort of contraption or device, and this is a way to produce some sort of power, right? And the steam engine is important because as long as you put enough coal on the fire, you can continue to produce this sort of pumping motion of up and down, up and down, up and down, and depending on what you connect that to, you could use it as a source of power. And this was significant because it replaced the way that things had been powered historically, quite literally since the beginning of time, right? So when it came to transportation, since the beginning of time, there were really only 4 different ways that people could get around. And this also includes the way that goods and services could be transported as well, right? Human power, you could simply walk from one place to another. Animal power, you could ride a horse, which was, again, very common. Wind power, you saw that used for like a sailing ship, for example, Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue. Water power, that'd be using like the current of the ocean or the current of the river. And this invention of the steam engine pretty much replaces all this and creates new methods of transportation. Most significant among them was steamships, which we talked about. Right, steamboats. There's technically a difference. I don't like the difference, but probably good to know. A steamboat only goes on a river. A steamship goes in the ocean. It's the same thing, right? It's a ship with a steam-powered engine on it. But then also railroads. And so when we talk about the transportation, sometimes called the transportation revolution, in fact, again, 1815 to 1850 is kind of what we're talking about here. It's really this down here, railroads, that becomes the last and most important step here. In 1815, transportation in the United States was abysmal, right? This, even in this time period, we're talking about a U.S. economy that is still geared more towards Europe, right, where more goods are being exported and trade is going on with Europe. But again, remember, this era of good feelings, one of the things that, Americans wanted to do was to really, we might say economic independence. The French Revolutionary Wars, which lasted roughly 1789 to 1815, in which Britain and France were at war with each other. That's when the French Revolution and Napoleon took over all of Europe. I mean, in those years, the American economy, it became clear that the American economy was way too reliant on outside powers. And the British and the French, for the most part, could dictate who the Americans could and could not trade with. And so it was very clear, at least to the United States in 1815, that there needs to be some sort of system of economic independence. And we saw this, scroll over a little bit. I'm running out of room everywhere. Move this over. We saw this with the American system, right? This idea that banks, businesses, and politics ought to work together to really harness and do everything that you could for the U.S. economy. We also learned that Andrew Jackson wanted to tear that thing to the ground. And so the development of transportation in the United States is kind of the step-by-step process. First, talk about roads. A turnpike is just simply a private road. In the era of horse-drawn carriages, roads were the most important. In fact, we even talked about the national road that was created, the first and last and only federal road project that built the road from Baltimore, Maryland, all the way to the Mississippi River. And so there are, private roads, turnpikes, state governments that are building roads. And the idea is to try to create an infrastructure that allows Americans to trade with each other, not just trade with Europeans. But then comes the invention of, the steam engine. And that really changes the game. Most importantly for steamboats and steamships, because what these can do is they're powerful enough to sail against the current of rivers, right? So if you look at probably the most important river in the United States, the Mississippi River, since the beginning of time, people could literally only sail one way down the Mississippi, and that was, down it to export goods. But with the invention of the steamboat and the steamship, the Mississippi River, instead of becoming a one-way street, now became a two-way street. And that was true for every single river in the country. Now every single river could be sailed up and down, or east and west. And so this unlocked kind of huge potentials for exporting and importing various goods. And suddenly, whereas it didn't make sense in the past, beginning, roughly around 1830-ish, 1820, 1830, 1840, it suddenly made a lot more sense to build canals, right? And we sometimes call this the Canal Age. So a canal is just a man-made river. Oops, that's a very ugly M. Man-made river. Right. Connecting rivers together within the United States, that could allow for, again, the more export, more import of various goods to allow people to travel. By far, the most successful, most famous, most popular canal that was built in this era was the Erie Canal. I want to say, I may be wrong about this, I want to say 1825 was when it was completed. This was the most successful and also the longest canal in the US. In fact, I'll say it was the most successful in the world, actually. All right. You can get an idea of where the Erie Canal was and just how important it was. So it was built in New York. It was completely funded by the state of New York. A lot of the laborers that built the Erie Canal were, in fact, a lot of those immigrants that came from Ireland. But the reason why it was important was because right here, and again, I don't know how well, everyone can kind of see this, but I'll draw it anyways. So New York City is right here, which was already a very strong kind of financial part of the country. It was one of the more important financial parts, even in the world. And the Erie Canal only made it more important because now what the Erie Canal allowed for people to do was to sail from the Atlantic Ocean wherever, sail right past New York City up the Hudson River. You might not be able to see the river here, but there's a river here, the Hudson. Sail across the Erie Canal, which was built right here, all the way across New York, and then get into the Great Lakes region, where you could eventually make your way by ship all the way to places like Chicago and pretty much everywhere else, right, that was in this area here. So now all sorts of goods could be brought into this Great Lakes regions, and all sorts of goods could be brought out thanks to the Erie Canal. And that made New York, because more and more goods went through this, up the Hudson River and through the city of New York, that made it all the more significant in terms of, a city or a financial center. Now, canal, there was a lot of canal construction. They built canals in some of these other areas. Pennsylvania built some, Ohio built some, Indiana built some. However, though, the canal age was, it was pretty short-lived. We might say, you don't need to know this, but maybe 1820 till about 1840 is what we're talking about. And again, because there were a lot of problems on the national level, especially with federalism, most canals were built by the states. So, New York built their own canals, Pennsylvania built their own canals. They did kind of connect with each other just because of the way that rivers connected with one another, but there was no sort of overall federal effort to create like this U.S. infrastructure of sorts. But the canal age was rather short-lived, and that was thanks to railroads. And railroads completely changed the game, right? Railroads, the same thing as trains, if you're not familiar with that term. It was essentially harnessing steam power and attaching it to what was at the time mine carts. So in mining, you lay down tracks. You have a cart that you fill up with, mostly probably rocks and stuff like that, and you pull it along the track. Now, typically, people would wear them as a backpack and kind of pull it themselves, or you might have an animal, right, a horse or an ox or something like that. A train or a railroad is just a mine cart attached to a steam engine, right? And that then, rather than having an animal or a person pull whatever it is, as long as you have enough coal to keep throwing on the steam engine, that action of heating up water and allowing the steam to, pressure and pull the piston up and go back and down, that propels then trains forward. And, just to give you an idea of just how significant railroads were, you can just kind of do a simple thought experiment. And that is to say, well, think about how much stuff can fit on a train, or how much stuff a train could pull. If you're driving and you ever get stuck at a train tracks, it seems like those trains never end, right? There's just endless amounts of goods. Now, how many animals would be required to carry the same amount as a train could, right? How many horses equivalent would you need to pull the same amount of goods as a train? And that's pretty much the change that's taking place here, right? Now, massive quantities of goods could be transported all across the world, inside the U.S., outside the U.S., on a degree that was never possible before. What would you need? Like all the horses in the world or something like that? Who knows, right? It's a lot. And the very first railroads were created in the 1820s and 1830s. Like we talked about before, industrialization was something that happened in Great Britain first, but the technology was brought over to the United States, and the United States was a quick adopter of it. It didn't take very long. By the Civil War, in terms of just total railroad mileage, the U.S. had more, we'll call them train tracks, than all the world combined. All right, so if you add it up, and I would say this was probably around 1860. I would say that date might be a little bit off. It might be later than that. But yeah, the United States had more train tracks than the rest of the world combined. You add up all the train tracks put together. So this wasn't something that was just, the amount of railroads that were built in the U.S. wasn't something that was just profound from the perspective of Americans. This was profound in a global sense, right? The changes taking place here. What impact did they have on canals? Well, canals just kind of died. So for example, the Erie Canal here, it was much, much cheaper to simply just build a railroad right alongside the Erie Canal. And that's exactly what happened. And the railroad, because it was cheaper to maintain and cheaper to construct, and could carry more goods, a train could, than a ship, it made the Erie Canal obsolete. And so this very brief kind of canal age, even though it was, flourished for a time period, it gets put out of business. It's like, what's cheaper? Laying down 2 iron bars or steel bars with a couple of wooden slats, or digging an entire man-made river. Railroads are just way cheaper. And they can carry more too. Railroads, though, were also helped along not just by private business, but also by government funding. So we might say, in order for these railroads to get constructed, this was a combination of, private business. So something like a railroad company. And a railroad company would build a railroad in order to try to make a profit, right? Maybe it costs $1 million to build a railroad from, along the Erie Canal here. The idea is that, well, hopefully you can make back more than $1 million that initial investment in charging people to use that railroad. And that's what business did. But also government incentives. Especially in this period, state levels, right? States had incentives that could be something like tax breaks. It could be cheap loans. It could be, giving away land. It could be passing favorable laws for these businesses. So it wasn't just, an effort by private industry. It was a joint effort. And this is especially true after the Civil War as well, but true here before. And when we look at the railroad in particular, I'm going to make a couple notes, or I want everyone here to make a couple notes about how railroads were constructed in the U.S. and what impact this has on the country. Lastly, we'll talk about one more technological innovation. It's not really transportation, but it's kind of like it. It's in communication. Right. So, for example, if one wanted to communicate, let's say between, well, New York and Baltimore is probably a bad example. Let's do New York and Chicago. Yeah, that's probably a bad example too. We'll just use it anyways, right? So if someone wanted to communicate between New York and Chicago, right? If we're kind of starting here, when there was no steam engine and barely any roads, it could take, 3 weeks to communicate. Well, with the invention of something like steamships, well, then it gets a little bit better, and railroads, it gets a little bit better. Telegraph makes communication almost instant. If you're not familiar, the telegraph is a way of sending electronic signals over a wire. So we might say communication over a wire, right? That's pretty. Does everyone kind of understand what that means, right? You send, they figured out that you could send electric signals over a wire, and if you just connected cities together with these wires, then you could send, again, kind of different sounds. It was Samuel Morse who created Morse code. This is the, you might say, the language of the telegraph. All right, so you have this little, I don't know what it looks like, something like this, right? And you push it, and you create a series of dots and lines. So you might dot, dot, bar, 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 dot, dot. And these all correspond with some type of letter, right? So this might be the letter B, this might be the letter Y, and this might be the letter E, right? So the other person on the other side who is listening to this, right? Dot, dot, dash, 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 dot, dot. They would be writing down the letters, and then you could read whatever the message was. And this type of communication was as instant as it took for, that, electricity to go over that wire. And so I want to use the example here just to give you an idea of just how profound these changes are taking place. And all of this is happening within like a generation. This is happening within one person's lifetime. And so for people who lived during this era, it really was revolutionary. It was almost frightening what was going on. I don't know how many comparisons today that we can make with something like the internet. I mean, the World Wide Web is maybe just as profound of a change taking place, I say today, but in the past 30 years or so as these sorts of changes. So I'm going to use the example here, and I like this example because it's it's historical. It doesn't pertain to the United States, but it just kind of goes to show you what's going on in terms of these changes. So here's England. Here's India, right? England laid claim to India in the 1750s. It was part of the 7 Years' War. The French lost. Of course, we learned about the 7 Years' War here in North America, but part of what the British successfully did was to kick France out of India. And so in trying to establish a control over India in the 1700s, it would take approximately 2 years to send a message to India and back, right? Because at least at this time, while using sailing ships, you had to wait for the natural winds to change during a season. So during one part of the year, you could sail up to India, but you had to wait for the winds to change so you could sail back. Again, a message took 2 years approximately to go around there. Now, with the invention of the steamship, right, the steam engine, that gets back down to about 2 months, right? So we might say it took 2 years at first. That goes down to 2 months. Engineering marvels like the Suez Canal, which is built right in here, then allows ships to travel this way. You can think of this as kind of like the Erie Canal, the equivalent in the United States, right? So with the Suez Canal, that's down to 2 weeks. And then with the telegraph, they could eventually just connect here, essentially one giant. I mean, they don't do it all in one piece, right? But as telegraphs are built, and eventually London becomes connected with India, you're looking at a 2-hour correspondence, right? And to just think of people waiting 2 years, right? Or you could think of it this way. India was essentially like 2 years away. Within one person's lifetime, it becomes 2 hours away, right? And that sort of feeling is a sense that not only the world is changing very rapidly, but that the world also in some ways is like becoming smaller. I mean, it's not physically becoming smaller, obviously, but it feels as if the world is becoming a much smaller place. And this, these types of changes were, obviously there are a lot of benefits from this technological change, but also, a lot of fear and anxiety about it. I mean, just think of it this way. If you had a friend in India or something like that and you lived in England, what you would do is you would write your letter, you would send it, then you would take out your calendar, you would move ahead 2 years, right? You would flip the pages 2 years into the future and mark down on your calendar, it's today, April 5th, 2021. So you'd mark down April 5th, 2023 and say, okay, that's when I can expect to receive a correspondence back, right? That's when I would get a reply. Now you send a message via telegraph, you eat lunch, essentially, a very long lunch, and then you get a message back in 2 hours, right? That's a pretty profound change. It's hard for us to imagine in our kind of world of, instant text messaging and internet messaging and stuff like that. But, it was a pretty dramatic things to go through. And so, for example, in the United States, Chicago, from New York to Chicago, it used to be 3 weeks away. It turned into 48 hours or something like that because of trains. So huge, right? Huge. Now at this point here, because this kind of gets back to our overall question, the geography of railroads. So I've got this image here. I can't remember which textbook I found this in, but this will illustrate this point absolutely perfectly. 1840 and 1860. What you're seeing here is railroads in the United States. One thing to just take notice is just how fast this is happening, right? It's just crazy to think that in just 20 years, essentially, railroads were like this, and then, later on like this. But I think 2 things to take note of. First is when you look at the United States and you see where most railroads are built, right? And if we compare, we would say, and I'll just give you kind of an example here. This is the dividing line between the free states and the slave states. I think Delaware. I don't know if Delaware's a free state or a slave state. I think it's actually technically a slave state. Anyways, whatever about Delaware. But anyways, that's the dividing line. And if you were to look at it that way, you would say that, well, most railroads are located clearly in the north or the free states. And that's true, right? So when we talk about all the changes and profound changes made by the transportation revolution, we want to understand that this is happening this is almost a purely northern phenomenon, right? This is happening most intensely in the north. In fact, it's so intense that, by the time of the Civil War, every single farmer potentially is within about a 20-mile radius of the nearest railroad, at least in the north. You don't get too many right here. I think there's, not the Apple, I think there might be mountains in this region here, so it might not be why you have as many railroads there. Anyways, that's number one, where the trains are located. Number two thing to take note of is the direction in which these railroads are going. And for the most part, we could tell that in the north, railroads are built in a way that go from east to west in general, right? For the most part, we see a lot of kind of horizontal lines going across, right? And that's true. And that's because in the north, the railroads were set up so that on the one hand, there were cities in the east, but not exclusively, and then farmers on the other hand. And pretty much goods and services went between the two. Cities produced whatever material goods there were, textiles, whatever it was. Farmers produced the food, and things went back and forth there. If you look at the railroads in the south, they're not really connected, east and west. If I didn't tell you these were railroads, you might guess that they were like rivers, perhaps. And that's because the railroads, mostly in the south, all are kind of geared towards funneling into these port cities, right? So you see kind of how eventually they tend to lead, most do anyways, kind of outwards, kind of like, water running down a mountain, these various port cities here. And that was because, for the most part, the railroads in the south were designed to export cotton, right? Cotton would be grown, this right here would be considered the cotton belt. All right, we'll just mark it in blue. All right, this would be kind of the cotton belt here, where a lot of cotton was grown. And again, most of that is for exportation. The third thing to take note of, in addition to where the railroads are, what direction they run, is the connection between the north and the south. If we look at this map, quite literally, the railroads are not connecting the north and the south, right? There's few exceptions. So between the free states and the slave states, there's one right here. One, let's see, Kentucky's a slave state, but essentially one railroad here and one right here. And so besides that, when we see all of these trains or train tracks, you could quite literally say that the north and south were simply just not connected to each other in terms of infrastructure, right? Northerners and Southerners are not essentially exchanging goods, at least not like Northerners do it themselves. Cotton is making its way to the north, don't get me wrong, right? You'll have cotton kind of be brought up this way after exportation, but there's no physical connectedness there, right? And so in thinking about some of the ways that the North and South become further apart, you could just say on like a most basic level is that, in terms of infrastructure, the North and South weren't really connected, right, to each other in that sense. Okay, so that is transportation. Here. Any questions on the transportation revolution? Okay, everyone good? Okay. Okay, third major change, right? So the population changes, the way that people get around changes, the way that people communicate changes. We'll just add, telegraphs there. The third thing is just something we're going to call the factory system. And the factory system, again, utilized that power of the steam engine. Right, steam engines were housed in what we called a factory, right, and this produced goods. And what it replaced was the hand making of goods, right? So again, kind of think of, we'll use textiles here because textiles or cloth products are the most kind of clear and obvious example. That the rise of the factory system, that the Industrial Revolution was the movement from people making things with their hands now to making things in a factory. And this allowed for, when we look at goods, more goods, cheaper goods, and in fact, contrary to what we might think, actually better quality. Factories, in most cases, produce better quality goods than than handmade, even though we think about handmade as being kind of the better quality today. Historically, not so much. So it's the rise of this factory system that, again, kind of leads to all these different changes in larger society. On one level, we can just look at the pure economics of it, and that is the expansion of business. You might say this is the transition from kind of local workshops and local economies to kind of bigger, more powerful business entities, specifically the rise of a corporation. Corporation is essentially a business model. Now, this wasn't unprecedented. So, for example, one thing that we talked about previously was joint stock companies. And a corporation works exactly like a joint stock company. And that is, in this case, factories themselves turn out to be very expensive, right? And so if you're an entrepreneur and you want to, build a factory, that's a lot, right? That requires, steam engines. That requires a building. It requires the various contraptions that are used, like spinning jennies and power looms, right? All the mechanical devices. Most people can't afford that. And so even though some maybe smaller scale production could be funded by just an individual person or an individual investor, it usually takes the resources from multiple people. And in the same way that, joint stock companies took, money from a pool, right? They sold stock and then they built a ship to go out and trade around the world. That's essentially what corporations do, is they sell stock to stockholders. They give their stockholders a piece of paper called a stock. They take the money, they pool the resources together, and then they build a factory. And the idea is that the factory will be profitable in a way that, gives each of their shareholders back some value. So this pooling of resources, the creation of corporations, and this worked very well with the industrial system because, especially with this, we have this term called economies of scale. And economies of scale applied to industrial production, and that is, for every dollar that you put in to, a production facility or a factory or something like that, you get an exponential out, right? An exponential amount of profit out of it. So just to kind of illustrate this point, you know, investing $1 in a factory yields a profit of $2, right? That's a very sort of straightforward kind of ratio, right? For every dollar invested, you get 2 out. Well, in an economy of scale, it means the more that you put in, the more that you put out. Now, you would think that if you invested $2, that you should get 4 out, that you should essentially double your money. But again, because of the nature of technology, the nature of sort of this factory system, it turns out that the more that you invest, you can actually squeeze more out, right? So $2 might yield $6 in terms of profit. So the bigger, the badder, the more technologically advanced factory that you could build, the more profitable you can become. And this is the reason why it's very difficult for like local factories to compete. And you add that with trains, right, with the ability to very cheaply transport goods around, and pretty soon it becomes a specific number of very selected areas, specifically early on in the United States, the Northeast. And we'll go ahead and just mark this right here. All right, we'll say Northeast was the center for industrial production. Right, Massachusetts especially, Connecticut, Rhode Island, right, kind of those areas. You know, once you get the biggest and baddest factories in those areas, it doesn't matter if you open up a factory, you know, in another part of the US, you can't compete because of how efficient these sort of things are. And so this also contributes, and we'll kind of make this point here to tie it back up to what we talked about earlier. This also contributed significantly to this rapid urbanization, right? Why are people moving into the city so much, right? Why is there in-migration from the farm to the city? Well, the city has all the factories, and the factory is where the job opportunities are, right? And you needed to live right next to the factory in order to, work there. And this is happening exclusively in the north. Now, a couple of things allowed for the factory system to flourish in the United States. So we'll go ahead and call this, advances in technology. We'll say this, allowed factory system to flourish. Machine tools. These would be the things required to make the machinery in a factory. All right, so we'll just say tools used to make machinery. It's kind of interesting. Machine A-R-Y, machinery. I don't know if that's spelled correctly. Anyways. It's like, you use machines to make stuff, but then you have machine tools to make machines that then make stuff, right? That's kind of the idea. It allows for, mass production of these kind of facilities here. And of course, you can see in this image right here what one of these factory villages would look like. And of course, within each of these buildings, you see the smokestacks. And the smokestacks would be steam engines that would be being used to create some source of power for machines to make various goods. Textiles were the first goods that were affected, but pretty soon everything was made by machines and everything was made by factories. Interchangeable parts, we talked about this previously. I'm not going to really go over it in too much detail again. We had talked about it when we used the example. Oops, not chapter 8, chapter 7. We'd used the example with the gun. The fact that things were made out of a series of parts rather than, being kind of like an entire unit. And again, this was applied to everything. It was the most useful when it came to the steam engine. And that was, if one part of this thing broke, well then, you wouldn't have to replace it all. You could just simply replace one single part to it. I mean, you could imagine how much of a headache it would be. And this is true for some products, right? That if one little part broke on it, you'd have to just replace the whole thing, right? Like if you're, I don't know, if you had like a problem in your car and, they said, well, looks like you just have to buy a new car. It seems so simple, it seems so obvious, it seems so brilliant. We'll just say this, made factory, let's say equipment. Cheap, that'll be a good word. You know, if you had to replace your entire car, right? Now one part of your car breaks, well, you can just take that part right out and put in a different part. Same thing with these factories. If the steam engine, you know, stopped working, you can just replace a certain part of it. Of course, this was Eli Whitney who invented this. You know, some automobiles are a real pain in the neck. You know, if something breaks on them and you have to replace it, ends up, you know, you have to order the part from overseas or something like that, and you know, only a few select people could do it. I sometimes like to make the comparison with like Apple products, right? You know, if one thing goes wrong with your iPhone or iPad, you have to, like, you know, replace the whole thing sometimes. You can't easily replace parts, whereas with other products you can more easily do that. So this change in production, again, when we think about the way that the factory system impacted the United States, we could point to urbanization. We can point to things like, again, more goods being made, cheaper goods, better quality goods being made. We could think about the ways that people move to cities, you know, population shifts, that's all true. But this industrial system also had a impact on family life, on social life, right? Just the way that people lived. Now, one of the things that the United States benefited from was the fact that it was Great Britain, which was the first nation to industrialize. And, you know, they had gone through the process of creating factory systems. And what was realized in a lot of these British cities were really kind of like the horrors of industry. You know, people moving to these cities and these cities being unprepared to you know, really take on such a huge population, a working class that was violent, that was drunk, that was constantly in trouble, cities that were overcrowded, there was pollution and disease and unsanitary conditions. So in the United States, there were efforts, at least early on. The United States could look at Great Britain and say, okay, how do we reap all the benefits here in the US? How do we reap all the benefits of more and cheaper goods, but avoid the horrors of industrialization like Great Britain did? And there were a couple of different experiments, you could say, that the United States went through. One of them was called the Lowell system, named for Lowell, Massachusetts. And the Lowell system was a system which only young women were hired. And H-A-R-E-D, it was only temporary. All right, that was the idea. Typically, the Lowell system, you see some what they call the Lowell mill girls is what they called them, the women that worked in the Lowell factory. And typically, what it involved was young women who typically grew up on a farm, and they would go away, move away from their family at a very, you know, at a somewhat young age, right? You know, maybe 13, 14, 15, 16, like in that area, and would live at the factory, right? So the Lowell system required women to live at the factory. And at the factory, you know, there were like dormitories and cafeterias, there was a church, and the women there lived under very strict supervision. There were certain rules like curfew rules and prohibitions on things like alcohol. But the idea is that the women would work there for a temporary amount of time, right? Maybe a couple years, save up some money, and then go off and get married and move away from the factory and likely live the rest of their life out on a farm somewhere, right? In sort of this family life. And, you know, this idea was, you know, the reason why it was embraced was for, you know, a couple of reasons. One was that while requiring young women to live at the factory, this created a more respectable workforce than what you would have in places like Great Britain. Very strict rules. It wouldn't be the constant kind of violence and fighting and everything else like that. And it kind of stuck with the kind of the social and cultural norms of the time, that women were expected to get married, and that this kind of working in this factory was kind of like going away to college in some ways. That's kind of maybe a kind of a contemporary sort of event that you can kind of apply it to. And the hope also was that there would be a lot less striking involved. It it existed for a short period of time. Ultimately, what sort of met its I would say what eventually didn't allow for systems like the Lowell system to work in the long run was just simply the cheap labor of immigrants who were just willing to work at a much lower wage. And eventually, the effort by the U.S., or some at least in the U.S., to try to avoid what happened in Great Britain, it doesn't really work out in the long run. There were other experiments to try and build factories like in the countryside, in the more rural parts of the country, to avoid the problems of like overcrowding and stuff. But at the end of the day, it kind of came down to a purely economic proposition, right? That simply labor was so cheap, and that ideally you actually wanted to build your factories in very dense areas because they had quicker access to railroads, and that ultimately was best for the dollar. All right. Generally speaking, conditions in in the factories, right? Hours, very long. A typical day in the factory could be anywhere from 12 to 16 hours a day. Wages, of course, were very low. We have to keep in mind that factory work was unskilled. The factories did all the work for you. I mean, the job could be simply something like just pushing a button or pulling a lever, which meant that everybody could do it, right? And if everyone can do it, and there are a ton of people there, right, because of immigration and population growth, well, that drives down wages, right? Wages are going to go down because you could essentially hire anyone to do it. And working conditions, we can say, were very dangerous, right? Very dangerous. Workplace accidents were common, injuries, deaths even. And ultimately, again, like I mentioned before, in most of these factories, you end up seeing a much more a workforce that tends to skew more towards immigration, right? Those who are newly arrived in the United States, not exclusively. And one thing that we ought to note also is that when we're talking about factory workers, it is men, women, and children. All right, this is the origins really of kind of wage work, working for a wage. And child labor, has its origins in this period, and it was, a huge problem for some. You don't really see many reforms in this period. It comes a little bit later, but I'll talk a little bit more after that. Let's go ahead and define these terms real quick. We're running a little bit low on time. I just want to get through this last section here. Artisans. These are people who make things with their hands. So we'll just say people who hand make. Oops. Goods. And of course, as a result of the factory, right, these people, the artisans, are pretty much out of business. They cannot compete with the factory. The factory makes, the shoemaker, for example, can't make a shoe that is cheap enough, can't make more of them than a shoe factory can. Unions were organizations of workers demanding, we'll say, and this is conveniently written here, demanding better hours, better wages, and better working conditions. So one way that workers tried to improve the workplace was to come together, create these organizations called unions, And they would ask for lower hours, ask for higher wages, ask for better working conditions. And they could use tactics like going on strike. They could petition the government. Unions at first were illegal. In the case Commonwealth versus Hunt, I think I want to say this was 1842. I'd have to check the textbook. This was a ruling that said unions are legal, right? I mean, so, even before that, it was illegal for workers to come together. They were, charged under like conspiracy laws or something like that. So Commonwealth versus Hunt, has to be a Supreme Court case, yeah. Said that in fact unions were legal, and then having the protection, having that protection allowed for unions to fight back better. And again, when we talk about working standards, very, very slight, slow, gradual improvement. Still very bad at this time period, right? But again, this is more like a process. Over time, workers' unions, right, using the strike, using the ballot box, voting for who they want in office, getting state laws, other laws, working standards tend to improve. Typically, when you look at legislation regarding the workplace, typically it was children who got the first protections. So some of the very first labor laws, I don't know about in the US, but at least in Great Britain, limited the amount of hours that children can work. Sometimes these extended to women, and then later on were passed for men, right? So I think I'll go ahead and stop there. We didn't get all the way through chapter 10, but that's fine. We'll go ahead and pick up with it next time. Any questions on chapter 10? Okay, so we'll go ahead and just, again, I will leave it at that for now. We'll pick up with it later.